We have 8 playoff series still to cover. If you haven't seen part 1 of this ranking, then you don't know what any of this is, how we got here, how it's all calculated, or what the heck this overextended metaphor is. You should watch the prerequisite now. Go on, it's right up here. You have to watch it. This video will always be here waiting to welcome you back. Welcome back. Let's get cracking. On to just about the pinnacle of stress-inducing series. Series that are long, hard, fought, and just plain agonizing. They're mired in expectations and saturated with controversy to the point where regular types of therapy, or even unorthodox forms of therapy, do us no favors. It's time to force our brains to forget. It's time to get chemical and wipe the memories from our brains with ungodly concoctions formulated by the brain trust of the deep state. It's time for MK Ultra. Each of these series is so good, and the difference between them when they're all at this level is negligible. Remember, this is an arbitrary statistical ranking that isn't going to catch or accurately quantify everything, so don't take it to heart if any of these placements are far from your own. So what's up first? Occasionally, in the annals of the NHL, there will be a series that is maybe not the most amazing series ever, but is still both really, really good, and, as fate would have it, a milestone in league history. It's with such a series that we find this cream of the crop begins with. The 2009 second-round bout against the Pittsburgh Penguins was such a series. Almost never in the history of the game have there been 2 generational superstars beginning play in the league in the exact same year. It's even more rare that they entered playing in the same division. It's unheard of for them to join 2 teams who have the history that they do. It's about the only good thing to come out of the full-year lockout in 2005. Penguins Sid and Capitals Ovi hitting the ice together at the same time. There's never been any hype like it before or since, and given the circumstances of their rookie year, there probably never will be again. It's something we take for granted, but nothing will ever top it. This was the first time these new faces of the NHL met on the biggest stage, so you better believe this series was hyped up in equal measure. If you were like most hockey consumers in 2009 and couldn't watch out-of-market games so you refreshed the box score page on your BlackBerry Torch 1,000 times, you would see an absolute all-timer. Aside from the obvious 7-game length and highest average goals per standing at 7, these tilts sported gigantic goal swings, the likes of which this era never saw before or since. In these 7 games, there were 9 lead changes. No other series had more than 7, and there were only 3 of those out of the other 23 series. Here, there was at least 1 in 6 different games. No other series had 1 in more than 4. Heck, even the series score saw a tsunami-like lead change. This round is why the lead change stat is weighted at all. The games had so many swings in score, sometimes from a deserving team overcoming bad goaltending and coming from behind, and sometimes undeserving teams finding the clutchness or star power to break the game. Because in any given game, both teams held star power and maybe play dominance, it gave both a sense of inevitability. And inevitability is electric. It's pretty ironic that in the only game where there wasn't a lead change, Game 7, there was never a prayer for the trailing team. But the Capitals had leads in all of Games 1 through 6, and they lost half of them. Credit to the Penguins, they came from behind in 3 of their 4 wins. The Caps obviously lost this series since it's the Penguins, but on the whole, the Penguins outchanced and outplayed the Capitals, so they deserved to win. Honestly, the Caps were lucky to not go out in 5 or 6, given how consistently the Penguins were able to outplay them. Really, it was Marc-Andre Fleury's down year and down playoffs that made this series as close as it was. Meanwhile, at the other end, we saw Semyon Varlamov's career-defining save. Fun fact, only 3 goalies who played in 2009 are still active in the NHL today. 2 of them are featured in this series, Semyon Varlamov and Marc-Andre Fleury. The other is Jonathan Quick, for what it's worth. This Capitals team was good. It was the first year of full season dominance in the Young Guns Rock the Red era, and after their heroic Game 7 win against the Rangers in Round 1 for their first playoff series win in nearly a decade, the Caps had nothing but hope. Heck, they were so confident that at that year's trade deadline, they did nothing. Oh, how things would change in future years. To lose in this Game 7 the way that they did was nothing short of crushing. But as mentioned, The present was bright, the future was bright, and people knew it would get even brighter. So there were only a few choker labels slung at the Capitals. For now. But you could make a great argument for it in this series. In every single third period where the Caps weren't effectively eliminated yet, they let the Penguins walk all over them. It's especially bitter, though, because Alex Ovechkin had the most dominant playoffs of his career, notching 21 points in only 14 games, tied for the most by any player with 14 or fewer games in this millennium. Not much more he could do for the Caps that year. Not much more was left to do, except do that thing that he has only 1/20th of a say in any given series. That thing that the wider sports world unfairly derided him for years for being unable to do: win. There's so much to like about this series. The action was great, and it was only heightened by an implicit feeling that we don't really get to experience that much. Promise. The promise that what these teams would bring to the league would make it so much better than it already was. A kind of restless, jubilant hope that everything was now changing for the better in this sport. And in every game, you could feel the home crowd believe that promise. The promise that both of these teams, with their generational superstars, were going to deliver. And here we are over 15 years later, with 4 Stanley Cups between them, each team having to go through the other to win it. And this was the beginning of the first. 2015 held a different kind of promise. It was a kind of proto-rebuild-on-the-fly promise for the Capitals, only the rebound up the standings was seismic. 2014 was the only year since making the playoffs for the first time in 2008 that the Ovi-era Caps missed them, until 2 years ago. That was a word salad. Ovi was 29, Backstrom was 27, and they still had plenty left in the tank, and the Capitals could not afford to be missing the playoffs in any year. So, Adam Oates and George McPhee were let go as coach and GM, and in came Barry Trotz and Brian McClellan. Trotz had been the only coach the Predators had ever known, with a 15-year tenure. Brian McClellan had never been a GM before. He was an assistant under McPhee for 7 years, but this was his apotheosis. Under these two, the team completely transformed into a shot-suppressing, contending, near-division-winning team, totally unrecognizable from what it was the prior year. Not least of all because of some pretty big free agents that were brought in over the offseason to stabilize the revolving doors at D. The lack of forward depth didn't get addressed though. Nobody's perfect. They only didn't win their division because of the Rangers, who were the best team in the regular season that year. But the Caps were still significantly improved. The Islanders in 2015 were good. Not good in the sense that they were considered contenders, but good in the sense that they had a deadly mix of underrated players and strong play driving and shot generating stats. Some might even say, best in the league. But they didn't have Braden Holtby, who was lights out in the regular season and possibly the Caps' most valuable player. But the Isles did have Jaro Halak, who was known for stealing series, just 2 or 7. So the Caps are good. The Isles aren't obviously good, but sneaky good. Everyone in Caps Nation should be groaning right now. And as it turned out, we got a series that has most of the hallmarks of a Caps chokey series, except they won. The hallmarks were 7 games, pretty close scores, and disappointing first outings. Game 1 was a lackluster affair that the Caps seemed half awake for, one that probably made everybody think, well, here we go again. But Game 2 was all Caps all the time, despite super deflating goals against early in the first, and then again immediately after a goal of theirs in the second. The guys in red stormed all the way back to take the game in electrifying fashion, in regulation no less. Game 3 was the beginning of the end for Nassau. What was thought to be the last playoff series the Isles would play in that legendary arena would begin with the 3rd installment against the Capitals. And the Islanders faithful were out in full force, making Game 3 effectively an inverse of Game 2. Were it not for Braden Holtby's heroics coming back from illness, this game would have been over long before overtime. Fun fact, after his retirement, Doc Emrick said that the loudest arena he'd ever heard was Nassau Coliseum after John Tavares scored Game 3's overtime goal. Boy, that overtime goal is such a comedy of errors. Every Capitals player was on a different page, it seemed. Oh well. And I can say oh well about it now because the Caps made Game 4 much more even and much more interesting, and won thanks to masterful penalty killing and an OT goal by Nick Backstrom that was identical to a goal he scored in Game 3. And I can say oh well because the Caps won Game 5 based off Evgeny Kuznetsov's first game as a playoff hero. It was really close until he and the Caps just took it over in the third. After the Isles walked the Caps in Game 6, Kuzi did it again in Game 7, scoring the game winner with 7 minutes to go, and somehow it wouldn't be his peak as a playoff performer. The demons of Jarro Halak were put to bed forever after that game, and the Capitals would advance. After Tom Wilson ended Lubomir Vishnevsky in Game 4, the series got really, really tetchy. Fights after final horns, fights proper, and social media shenanigans abounded. But the Caps won. Everything else is a footnote. Both teams brought about the same oomph to this series in aggregate. Interestingly, the individual games weren't as close, as most games actually had the home team pretty significantly outplay the visitor. But given that despite that, the score was almost always within 1, that means the crowd is really into it because their team is playing great, and the outcome of the game is still kind of up for grabs. That's a great recipe for great hockey. And that is exactly what we got. So, we're here in a CIA bunker deep beneath the nation's capital, and who walks in but the president? He has a very important message. He says the contents of this dossier should require a much, much higher clearance than what mere 6th place would indicate. The very presence of this series, in his judgment, and in mine, means that we're going to DEFCON 2. The raised DEFCON level is because drug-induced brainwashing may not be enough to cope with how stressful this series was. There are 3 reasons why. The first is obviously because of the statistical ranking, but before I get to that, let me expound on the second and third reasons. The former is because of the absolutely massive expectations that were on the Capitals that season. Brian McClellan had grabbed TJ Oshie and Justin Williams in the 2015 offseason, each with 2 years under contract with the Capitals. In McClellan's estimation, this gave the Caps a 2-year window where they'd have the most stacked roster in the league and the fewest excuses for not taking home the cup. This was the second and final year of that window. The Caps won their 2nd straight President's Trophy, and yet, somehow that angst around this possibly being the Ovechkin era's last shot was palpable. Game 1 was the Capitals at their most mentally frail. They got outplayed early, having to rely on the power play to make a comeback on the scoreboard. In further games at Verizon Center, you could just feel the Capitals and their fans shrivel and get rattled after every goal against. And that was only accentuated because of the latter reason. The latter reason is how the Maple Leafs scored like half of their goals. Super lucky bounces. That's not to say they didn't work for them or that they shouldn't have been close in this series. Every series is going to have those goals. But the sheer amount of them that the Maple Leafs had was just ridiculous. Even a lot of the chances against were just super unlucky for the Capitals. Clearing passes that got blocked and just dropped like a rock right where a Leaf could pick it up. A random deflection takes another random deflection right towards one of them and the like. The reason this acts like an exponent to the stress factor is because, well, playoff hockey is already stressful and random. We go into a game expecting there to be some of that. But when that randomness bites your team in the butt at unprecedented rates with unprecedented consistency, all of a sudden, you're looking out for it every second of the game. You're on edge, and the line between fun and agonizing is blurrier than ever. So that's enough of the conceptual stuff. Let's get back to the stats. This matchup sported an average of 62 scoring chances per game, the second highest amount any series had. So there was plenty of action, but in addition to that, probably the most impressive thing about this series is how consistently each team played. Outside of 1 second period for the Leafs and 2 third periods for the Caps, for basically every game, these teams generated chances one right after the other, lucky bounces or otherwise. I would say that the stats do the eye test justice in this case, for sure. The Maple Leafs were making the playoffs for the first time in only 4 years, but there was much more promise with this team than with the 2013 one. Some recent, very high draft picks were making their playoff debuts and propelling their franchise back into relevancy. And in the near future, contention. Does that sound familiar? That's where the Caps were, a decade prior. Toronto and Freddie Anderson, who was great, gave Washington everything they could handle, particularly in DC, pouncing on the Caps' apparent frailty. So they have every right to be proud of their effort. But all in all, the better team won. So yeah, given all that, do you think DEFCON 2 is justified? I do. As I said, it was already a nail-biting, agonizingly close series, but given the offensive fireworks and the fear that the Leafs would just get another bounce completely out of nowhere, and the baseline stress of knowing this was probably the Ovi era's last mulligan, yeah, the president made the right call. Oh, and did I mention? 6 games. 5 went to overtime. The statistical model that ranks these series is meant to divine how objectively good the series was. The therapy needed from stress metaphor is just a thematic extension. But if we're measuring series by therapy needed from stress, I don't think any other tops this one. No amount of MK Ultra can overwrite the memories of this one. We are stuck with it. The Capitals' first-round series against the Bruins in 2012 was Boston's first since the chaotic and rage-filled Cup final of the previous year. Being the Stanley Cup champion, they were the obvious favorites. The Bruins had a near-league best 5-on-5 offense. The Capitals did not. The Bruins' offense could outplay their defense. A 90-year-old could outplay the Capitals' defense. The Bruins drastically out-attempted their opponents in shots. The Capitals did not. And so on and so on. It's not like the Caps were bad, but the Bruins had everything you could ask for come playoff time. Experienced veterans in key roles, a dynamite goalie, and winning grit. Good lord, were they gritty. I mean, they won the last year's Cup for a reason. Of the 77 high-profile writers that gave first-round predictions, only 6 predicted the Capitals would prevail. And one of them said the series would come down to who has the most well-fitting skates. You know which of them it was. None of the 6 do Stanley Cup predictions anymore. The CIA liquidated them for stepping out of line. But you know, a defending Stanley Cup champion can't go any higher. The only place they can go is down. And the only place a wet behind-the-ears Braden Holtby can go is up. What ensued was one of the most brutal, hard-fought series you'll ever see, and the very first series ever in NHL history where all 7 games were decided by 1 goal. Think about that. Every game, 1 goal. The goal disparity column is utterly barren. Utterly. Far and away the tightest scoring series on this list, and probably in the post-lockout NHL period. That incredible feat alone, across 7 games, should make this series a must-watch, but it gets even better. Now, in these rankings, I don't usually reveal how the game goes score-wise or who won, in order for you to reap the full benefits of watching it with bated breath, but because of that record-breaking goal parity, I'm going to make an exception, so you can see how we got there. Game 1 was the Bruins game. They had the edge on the Caps in the first and dominated the second thanks to extended power play time. But although the Caps came out swinging to start the third, nobody found pay dirt until Chris Kelly did just over a minute into overtime. Game 2 saw a significant scoring change increase and a much closer balance of play, with giant swings of momentum eventually evening out, bringing the game score way up. It was a masterful defensive game from the Capitals, who frustrated the Bruins offense all night, and it would have given their offense much more of a chance to shine on the power play if the rules had been enforced. Again, since the score was so close, even through a full extra OT, it was absolutely nerve-wracking to top the blood boiling caused by the nasty hockey. But that makes it all the more special when you can breathe easy. Before Game 3, that's when Caps fans really started to believe. They held the Bruins' mighty offense to 2 goals in 2 games, and they were done with low-scoring games. This one would end up 4-3, with the series' first lead change thrown in to boot. The game's Corsi and expected goals for charts fly in completely opposite directions, which is something you almost never see. I have no idea what to make out of it, but watching this game, you don't care about the stats. It was an electric atmosphere, and both offenses finally started to get pucks past the opponent's goalies. But ultimately, a late Caps comeback got undone by an unfortunate deflection off Roman Hamrlik's stick in the final 2 minutes. The Caps defense kind of cratered, but that meant we got to see more scoring at least, and Carl Alsner's immortal crybaby motion. It was a fantastic game, and the best of the series according to this model, and the 17th best game of the Ovechkin era straight up. Down in the series 2-1, in Game 4 the Caps got heavily outplayed and outchanced by the Bruins, but the 56 scoring chances were a series high, and thanks largely to a goal on their first shot, a late second period push, and Braden Holtby playing one of the most composed playoff games you'll ever see from a rookie goalie, they came away the winners 2-1. As far as enjoyment goes, none of the possession or shot disparity matters nearly as much if the game is tied, because all it takes is one chance to break the game either way. Through the first 4 games of the series, there had not been a single second in which either team led or trailed by more than 1 goal. In the 4 games to start a series, that never happened anywhere else. In any 4-game stretch, it only happened once. We'll get to that. Game 5. No, they ruined it. Ugh, our perfect tight game streak, it's gone. Oh well. Despite being slightly outplayed in the first half of the game, the Caps went up by 2 on some quick strikes from Alex Semin, who was money in this series, and Jay Beagle, who is always money. By the way, you want proof that hockey's a game of micrometers? Semin's goal doesn't happen if Zanin's stick isn't already snapped, or if the D's skate kicking back doesn't lift up Thomas's stick, or if Semin doesn't corral it at exactly the right time, or if it hits any of those 5,000 legs standing in the crease. But the Bruins answered on 2 tough goals against in about half a minute. Massive momentum swing. And it was all Bruins for the rest of the game. Until...
Led back up the wing, Semin a shot, score!
Both goalies were very human in this game, giving up 2 tough goals each, but that means more goals. Game 6, the Caps had a chance to close it all out, completing an amazing upset in front of their fans. For those fans, they actually out-attempted the Bruins for the first and only time in this series, just by a hair. This was a penalty-filled game and thus saw pretty large swings in momentum either way, which ended up favoring the Bruins by a smidge, and despite some late-game heroics from Ovechkin, who hadn't really been given good line mates and in hindsight was pretty significantly held back under Dale Hunter, they lost in OT. The tetchy, tight as you could possibly get series would, of course, go to 7 games. Because that's just what happens in the Alex Ovechkin era. But as the 7th seed and the underdog, there was just that much pressure not on the Caps. And in an otherwise ultra-conservative Game 7, either goalie was beat only by a stupid deflection from the wonderful Matt Hendricks, or a Johnny Rocket that Holtby failed to sweep away at the last instant. And once we crawled to overtime, ladies and gentlemen, some lost media. Joe Beninati's call of this game's overtime goal.
Knuble steamrolling in. Knuble his backhand. Stop. Score! On the rebound. Joel Lord. And the Caps knock off the defending champs.
Before I say what I'm about to say next, I want to remind the viewer that to that point in the 94-year history of the NHL, the 2012 Eastern Conference quarterfinals between the Bruins and the Capitals was the closest 7-game series ever played. Ever. It came off the backs of a Washington team who sported uncharacteristically great defense, elite penalty killing, and phenomenal goaltending from Braden Holtby, despite all the things they'd done to shoot themselves in the foot. But here's the only knock against this bout. Remember when I said in Game 4 that its 56 scoring chances were a series high? That's not that high. It's a little above average. The overall average for scoring chances was 43.42. That's the lowest of any series in the Ovechkin era, and good lord, it's not even close. Game 7 had 32. You heard that right, 32. That's 1 scoring chance every 2 minutes. The low event nature of this series is such a stark blemish on what would otherwise be a nasty, close, pulse-pounding series that went the distance in every single game. This is where the games of these series fall in the scoring chances spectrum. In the dumps. But in every other category, they're stellar. And score-wise, if not play-driving-wise, we got the closest played series in the NHL ever to that point. What more could you ask for? Well, the Caps' very next series, apparently. The Bruins were the 2 seed. The Rangers were the 1 seed. Maybe they weren't as intimidating because the Caps just completed an underdog win, so what's a second one? But the Caps were once again going to have to scale a massive obstacle. Pretty rare to see that in the Ovechkin era, much less twice in a row. The specter of the choker label didn't really hang over them yet the way we know it did, so it's easy to watch this series with fresh eyes. So how did they do? They also pushed the Rangers to 7. Those Caps, man. But there were 3 glaring differences between this series and the Bruins series. First, there wasn't the same level of nastiness. Fine by me. Second, Holtby started to show signs of being human, and against playoff Henrik Lundqvist in the other net, that might be all it takes for it to come up Rangers. Third, this series, offensively, had so much more going for it. Still not amazing from a number standpoint, but these chances were far crazier than in the Bruins series. Game 1 was really tough for Holtby, and I'd say goaltending is why the Caps lost a low-event Game 1, but starting in that game and going all the way to Game 6, we saw stretch plays and chaos plays that utterly defied the narrative that the low-event stats were writing. It doesn't make much sense. I don't care. Do you all know what entropy is? I don't, but I know that it's a word often used to describe the prevalence of randomness and disorder over time. And I feel like that word describes this Capitals playoff run to a T. The series against the Bruins was tight and pretty low event. Despite the chippiness, goals were mostly scored on clean shots. As time went on against the Rangers, everything started to fall apart. Pucks rolling, bodies flying, defenders falling, end-to-end skating, sticks shattering, shots fluttering, whiffs, saves, anything and everything that could happen did to completely destroy concerns about there being another low-event series. Here's a brief, non-exhaustive montage of entropy.
Hardy harassed by Ovechkin, follow-up by the Caps. Ovechkin stayed onside. Light tried to work by, kicked along by Ovechkin, and he'll be penalized. Led to the back now, Whiteman across. Drive by Carlson. Turnaround shot by Simmons. Drive by Whiteman. Fought off by Lundqvist. Back to Whiteman again. They hurried along. Carlson, a shot. He scores!
The referee. There's a big hit. Another one by Hendricks. He just kicked McDonough. Hendricks steals the puck. Bauer. Shot wide.
Handled on around. Oh, and Backstrom sent down and eats him off, and then is run into. And now Backstrom scores! For it is Gabrick. Gabrick led one back. Delzano trying to move in. Puck bounced across. Oh, and a shot by Richards. Turned aside by Holtby. To the back to Green. Fires one. Deflected in front. Battle for there by Ovechkin. Loose puck in front. Oh, and coming across with a pad. Turning now and working. Strawman intercept. On rifled and onto the back. Stahl with a shot. Save made by Holtby. Turnaround shot. Save made by Holtby. Held him along the boards legally enough that Kreider gave it away. Ovechkin and shot off. Rangers. Simmons holds this one now on the power play. It's been out for light and into the catching glove.
A couple of games. Here's Ovechkin with a burst of speed. A backhand pass to the front of the net. Now a shot. Hit the post.
If that doesn't make you want to watch it, what will? Remember, that is not an exhaustive montage. There's plenty more that I didn't make note of or just didn't include for time. But there are a few individual moments I want to point out for when you watch this series. It's all on YouTube, by the way. You can see it whenever you want. First of all, Jason Chimera from 2011 to 2013 was a Rangers killer in the playoffs. He had something like half a dozen game winners against them in the playoffs alone. For certain people, when they play against specific teams, sometimes the puck just keeps going in. He had 3 against the Rangers in this series, and the last was the Game 6 winner. Secondly, Matt Hendricks. While he didn't get on the score sheet too much, he was an absolute menace to them in this series. He was one of the most electric, energy fourth liners you'll ever find, and he was super noticeable for the Caps here. It sucks that he was never rewarded for his effort with a goal, but that's just how it goes sometimes. On a Caps team that had a plethora of versatile, likable guys, he was one of the versatilest and likablest. Game 4 saw goals from Ovechkin, Green, and Backstrom like it was 2009 again. In a win that ensured the Caps would get another game at Verizon Center, that's a big boost for the former Young Guns who had not been nearly as electric for some time. Ovi had seldom been more scrutinized than after his suspension that year. Backstrom had been concussed and missed half the season, and Green had also had head injuries and groin surgery, so that win from them was just such a relief. Words can't do it justice. Every time the Caps knotted up the series, which they did 3 times, it was reaffirming how much desire that they had. To hell with being an underdog, they were there to win. Another great trend to keep an eye on is Henrik Lundqvist. We all know how great he is, but to me, this series looked like him at his most composed. I never really saw him make diving, split saves, or anything ostentatious like that, but he never needed to. His positioning and anticipation was just that awesome. Ironically, I think we can best see this in a goal against. In Game 5, Brooks Laich got one by him from the slot, which is a super hard save to make for any goalie. It looks like he just guessed wrong, but if you look closely, you can see that Laich's shot was actually going right, which is where Lundqvist ended up going. In a split second, I think Hank read Laich's body language and his weight distribution, intuited that the shot was coming to that side, and committed. But the puck deflected off Callahan's stick into the left, resulting in a goal. But had Laich got the shot off cleanly, it would have been a save, and it would have looked like a pretty routine one. But that betrays how well and how quickly Lundqvist would have had to read Laich, the shooter. And finally, the end of Game 5. Actually, I'm not gonna reveal it. I want you to go find this game on this website and see it for yourself. All I'll say is this: the big cheese giveth, and the big cheese taketh away. I don't think you'll ever see anything like it. Honestly, seeing this series at number 4 really hurts. In my heart, I think this series and the Toronto series should be numbers 2 and 3. Seeing them at 4 and 6 almost makes me a statistics atheist. I worked pretty diligently to make sure this model takes all things into account, but the actual 2nd and 3rd place series being ahead of this one just doesn't compute to me, especially 2nd place. Maybe I'm biased. Maybe I'm fooled into thinking it's more exciting because the crowd sounds more into it, because the audio mixing on NBC's feed is fantastic.
Still up there for Backstrom. Carlson took his man, but now trying to finesse his way free was Richards. Hit back over, and the Rangers just getting to the puck first.
Maybe I don't see things objectively, and that's what the model's for after all. But like I said before, so little separates every series in this video. Maybe the opinions of one little YouTuber don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy sport. Speaking of hills, the 2012 Capitals somehow, some freaking how, scaled one of the biggest hills they could and nearly cleared the second. They were 6 seconds away. They made miracles happen through no lone source. Their just okay roster somehow, some freaking how, pushed the East's 2 best teams all the way and capped off a run that was so close to the conference final, which would have killed the second round exit memes before they even really began, with another legendary series that doesn't get the respect it deserves. 2012 against the Rangers really stands the test of time. These Capitals lived life by the flip of the coin, mustering the absolute best hockey their just decent team could, and leaving it up to the game of millimeters. The 2012 Capitals lived by the razor's edge, and by God, they died by it. Traveling through all of these series to this point, hopefully I've made it obvious what about them it is that causes the blood pressure to spike, the will to waver, the skin to break out. The traumatizing awesomeness of those series was purely because of purely awesome games, no matter which way you slice it. But with this next room, the series becomes so good that we don't need therapy for them at all. The product put before the viewing audience in these final 3 transcends the limits of what we know to be human entertainment, and simply sweeps us away to nirvana. These series are so close, so long, so fun, that while watching them we realize we have no need to be upset. For surely this is the pinnacle of human existence, to watch hockey this good. We have no need to fear the outcome, because what we're seeing is just so awesome. We are liberated from the shackles of anxiety. We are free. And to start this list, we can thank one man for it. Gabby. This wonderful man was hired 43 years to the day after the Kennedy assassination, after the Caps started off with a putrid 6-14-1 record, and under his watchful eye, the 2007-2008 Capitals roared back, going 37-17-7 to not only make the playoffs, but take the Southeast Division crown, setting up what would be the very first playoff series of the Ovechkin era. Under Boudreau, holy cow, they felt invincible. To put things in perspective, this was Alex Ovechkin's career year. Think about how much hardware a first ballot Hall of Famer would have to take home to have a career year. He looked unstoppable, the Caps looked unstoppable, except for in goal where they traded for Cristobal Huet, who actually played really well. And they were rewarded for a 9-1 end to the season with the 3 seed in the East, and a date with the Flyers. Now, although the Flyers had a better record than the Caps, from a numbers standpoint, they weren't as good. As a matter of fact, they weren't nearly as good cumulatively as the Capitals were. But it was still a rebuilding team's first playoff series. Anything could happen, and just about everything did. The first playoff series of the Rock the Red era gave the Caps fans a taste of what was to come. Primarily, a very long, very close series. Let's give the results a once-over. An above-average amount of lead changes, goals, and scoring chances is rare enough, but the model doesn't give them too much of a weight. An average amount of time with goal differential, well, that's not great either. And a below-average play-driving differential, that isn't game-breaking either. So why is this series above number 4? Honestly, I think it just comes down to the fact that there was more offense. Most other averages compared to that series are pretty close, except that one. Is that a good enough reason? I don't know. Like I said, the model isn't perfect because no statistics can catch the feel for the speed of the game. And while this is undoubtedly a great series, rewatching it and number 4 a decade plus after the fact, I just don't agree with its placement. But I made the model, I have to eat the crow. But you know what? It's still a great watch. And one thing to keep an eye out for was the first iteration of the question, how do we shut down Alex Ovechkin in the playoffs? Answered in the person of Mike Richards. Both players, funny enough, had just signed decade-plus giant contracts, which only one of them completed, and they couldn't have much more opposite deployments in the playoffs. Mike Richards at that time was a young center who sported some great two-way play, and because he was a Flyer, he was also pretty chippy. And he was still like an 80-point getter somehow. He was a beast. And he was tasked with getting under the skin of Alex Ovechkin in the latter's first playoff appearance. He definitely played Ovechkin physically, probably the most physically Ovechkin's ever been challenged in the playoffs outside of 2012 against the Bruins. But as much as Richards played hard against Ovechkin, I don't know if it was nearly effective as, say, a Girardi McDonough D pair would be. The best counter to any goal scorer is another one, and this is where I mention playoff Danny Briere. He is playoff Danny Briere. He is a separate entity from Danny Briere. Playoff Danny Briere has his own otherworldly skill level and clutch factor that regular Danny Briere could only hope to achieve. Of course, Briere, Richards, and Ovechkin weren't the only factors at play in this series. There was a quartet of Caps young guns who were also making their playoff debuts. And when they factored into goals at Verizon Center, the crowd just blew the roof off of it. A thrilling come-from-behind win in Game 1 capped off by Ovechkin's first ever playoff goal with about 5 minutes left to go, and there could not be a better way or better time to have grabbed it. Unfortunately, Martin Biron shut the door on the Caps in the next 3 to push them to the brink of elimination. As the Caps surrendered the series lead and then gave it to the Flyers, the tide of play also began to favor Philly as the adrenaline from starting the first playoff series of the era in DC wore off. And despite an even double overtime battle in Game 4, they came away the losers. Down 3-1 in the series, and with Ovechkin only having 1 goal in it, people understandably wrote off the Capitals. It just wasn't their time yet. Cue Verizon Center breaking the sound barrier as the Capitals throttled the Flyers, never once letting up through 40 minutes and skating to a 3-2 win that really shouldn't have been that close. In my infallible and eternally correct categorization of playoff games, the Caps' Game 5 effort definitely falls under the home team domination label. And in Game 6, Cristobal Huet saved the Caps from an insurmountable 3-0 hole, and Alex Ovechkin scored twice to engineer a comeback victory to force Game 7. Remember when I said Philly in 08 gave the Caps a taste of what was to come? Well, here it is, laid totally bare for you. According to the model, Game 7 of this series is the greatest playoff game of the Ovechkin era, with a game score of a gargantuan 285.6. A lead change, a lot of offense, no score disparity, and a razor-thin margin of play. And it's not like there was little action behind that percentage. Both teams combined for almost 8 expected goals. That's actually pretty substantial. And for the totals to get that high and remain even, yeah, that's special. Statistically, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more perfect game, a more exciting game. So of course, this means the Capitals lost, in overtime. after losing the lead. Gotta teach him young, I guess. Funny enough, of the top 10 highest scored games in the Ovechkin era, the Capitals lost 8 of them. There were some pretty goofy moments in this series, like Ovi wearing Boyd Gordon's helmet for some reason,
Backstrom, they score! On the weak side,
UA making the save of his life in Game 4 but getting scored on anyway, Donald Brashear of all people scoring the first playoff goal in DC in 6 years, and seeing those things makes the loss sting a lot less in hindsight. It also helps that this was almost 20 years ago, and that we know now, like the world was only mostly convinced of then, that the Capitals would be electric to watch for years to come. With this series, the Alex Ovechkin era started off on one of the highest of notes, and it never looked back. In 2008, the Caps were fresh-faced, their fans were wide-eyed, and the world was their rink. Oh, when time was young and life was warm, in the words of Lewis Carroll. But nothing gold can stay, in the words of Robert Frost. The shine wears off, the patience drops out, and the nerve shatters. In the words of Death Clock, open your textbook and turn to the chapter concerning your death. This was the round that well and truly defined the Caps as chokers. In most of their 9 previous series, save for maybe Montreal in 2010, they usually just flat out lost to a team that was playing better. But this one? At various points, the Caps just visibly, painfully choked. It's kind of difficult to watch because, well, not because of anything you can really see, but you can sense it. You can sense the trepidation and lackluster crowd. You can sense the Caps are just holding their sticks too tight, but only at the worst of moments. It just doesn't feel like it was up for grabs the same way the 2012 series was. But how I feel is not objective. Statistics are. And they tell a pretty good story. Game 1 was fine, but each successive game had more and more things go right. First, a closer score, then closer play, then more goals and lead changes, staying at a really smart-looking clip, until Game 7. Let's start with the positives. On balance, the Caps played better than the Rangers, particularly in Games 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7. In overtime of Game 2, Mike Green scored probably the loudest overtime goal ever heard in the district.
Walking it on, fakes the drive, back to Green!
But despite that and some other really smart-looking plays from the Caps in front of the home crowd, they just felt like they were going to lose. It's like each game showed a different symptom. And together they made a cocktail called Golfer's Delight. All throughout Game 2, they either failed to score on gimmies or ran into prime Henrik Lundqvist. Usually the former, though. In Game 3, Holtby, man, Caps were dominating and he lets in a bad one. Takes a penalty against and then gets scored on in that power play. And it's a crying shame that it happened in that game because it was one of the closest games I have ever seen played, correlating not coincidentally to a game score of 267.5, the 4th best of the era. Game 4's loss was a mix of really bad penalties against and another soft goal, which you cannot give up against someone as great as Henrik Lundqvist. And Game 5, well, the Caps won Game 5, so that's all well and good. Game 6 was a classic instance of ruining, not sinking early chances, because you best believe you're getting goalied in the second half of the game. Too little, too late. And Game 7? Well, Game 7 just falls under the playoff game category of lying scoreboard. It was a close game. I'd say the Caps actually had the edge in play, but the score got lopsided early, so the outcome was never really in doubt. A crummy end to a series that you could feel the bottom was going to drop out of eventually. Maybe the Caps needed to short-circuit these things to ensure that we'd get a series this close and this good. That's mighty kind of them, but I'd rather they just win. In 2013, the Caps were in a weird transition period as a franchise. Not really a rebuild, but not intentful enough to be a retool either. Adam Oates was hired as their new coach, and despite some questionable lineup decisions, he engineered a massive turnaround in the back third of the season to get the Caps into the playoffs and got a resurgent season out of Alex Ovechkin. There was good reason to be excited. On the skater front, Semin was gone. He had departed in the offseason, leaving only 3 of 4 young guns remaining. And Troy Brouwer was there to try and fill in the gap on Ovi's offside. Bless his heart. Matthew Perreault's departure and Brooks Lake's injury left a gaping hole at center that Mike Ribeiro filled, and was really good in, actually. A point-per-game player and a playoff OT goal? Can't ask for much more out of a one-year stint than that. The defense was a revolving door of seemingly everybody on Earth, and it wouldn't get sorted out until after the next season. See what I mean about it being a weird time? It's funny in hindsight, but people were really optimistic for Adam Oates' tenure. There was a feeling that the Caps players trusted and liked him, and that they gelled together as a team beneath him. 2013 was a season of redemption for the Capitals, and it all came crashing down in one horrific game. This series is really exceptional because of just how little separated these teams. You may not think that that's that rare, but for it to happen this consistently across this many games, in games that weren't total snooze fests keeping the score low, the tiny average expected goals for percentage differential is just icing on the cake. That's the trend we've seen in basically all of these series in this video. At least above average action, regardless of whether or not the balance of play is close, yet the scores somehow remain close and low. Two goalies playing great and keeping the score low and close is probably the single greatest boon a playoff series can have for its stats. This isn't my choice for number 2. I don't think I'd even put it in the top 5. But the imperfect model is an imperfect model, and the Caps were an imperfect team that couldn't get it done when it mattered most in 2013. We can talk about all the cliches of what makes a team that ends up winning. The Caps were able to have them all, but they just didn't win. As mentioned before, the Alex Ovechkin era has had a crazy disproportionate amount of overtimes, close games, and long series, enough to take years off the lives of Washington fans far and wide. In my very first video on this channel, the rankings of the last 15 Cup Finals series, 64.4% of games were over the meh score of 100. In the rankings of the 2023 playoff series, 54.5% of them were. In all of the 140-plus games of the Alex Ovechkin era, nearly 3/4 of them cleared that bar. The chances of there even being a subpar game in the Ovi era playoffs are way lower than the other baselines recorded to this point. If you want to follow one player's playoff career who's almost guaranteed to have at least one really exciting series every year, this is your guy. And we may not even be done. The Caps are one of the league's best teams nearly a third of the way through the season. A lot of things can happen in the next 50-odd games, but right now, the Caps look like a good bet to make the playoffs at least. Should they make the dance? How good do you think that series or those series will be? If the past is anything to go off of, they'll be must-watch events. And how else would you rather end what is likely the last year of the career of the most exciting goal scorer of all time? A massive, heartfelt thank you to every single one of my patrons, especially Balling Kitten 43, Eric Sheldon, Ethan Johnson, Infernos Gaming, It's Me Kowalski, Jules, Len Nicolisi, Pierre O'Connor, Pylon Zin, Steely Dan 32, and Stuckmund.